Hello, and welcome to Radical Engagements. And I am interrupting both our series on the Ingalls Bakunin debate and our series on Bodega for a tribute to Loren Goldner. I'm going to read Goldner's discussion of a book that I like, but actually find Goldner's critique of quite interesting. The book is Max Elbaum's Revolutions in the Air, a book that I tell people to read to understand the failure of the new communist movement, which came after the New Left. Now, Goldner died, I believe, on April 12th of this year. He's been suffering a long decline. For those of you who don't know who Loren Goldner was, he was one of the editors of Insurgent Notes back in the day. He also wrote several books. The most recent one was Revolution, Defeat, and Theoretical Underdevelopment, Russia, Turkey, Spain, and Bolivia in 1917 for Haymarket. 1917. In 2017 for Haymarket. He ain't that old. But he also wrote several other books, including Ubu Saved from Drowning, Worker Insurgency and Status Containment in Portugal and Spain, 1974 to 1977 and 2000, The Vanguard of Retrogression, Postmodern Fictions as Ideology in an Era of Fictitious Capital, 2001, and Herman Melville Between Charlemagne and the Anti-Mesoic Cosmic Man, Race, Class, and Crisis of Bourgeois Ideology in the American Renaissance Writer, 2006. So we saw Goldner have a diverse set of literary and political concerns, kidnap the maintainer of BOP secrets and a lot of the information about the Situationist, spoke highly of Goldner. And Goldner's website, Break Their Hardy Power, will be in the link for you. Goldner's perspective is generally left communist, often considered ultra leftist, but with a huge cultural awareness and an awareness of things like the Situationist, classical communism, etc. Now, Max Elbaum's breakdown of the new communist movement, I think, is interesting for a variety of reasons because it's kind of talks about the way in which these things unfold and collapse. But Goldner has some things to say about it, and a lot of what Goldner has to say is actually also interesting. So we're going to read this article, which was a review of Revolution in the Air, Radicals Turn to Lenin, Mao, and Che from Verso 2002. Now, I bring this up because the Revolution in the Air book I have suggested 10 years after it came out and 20 years after it came out. I suggested it to people as a negative example of what not to do after Occupy, and this burgeoning new left, which was moving from its alter globalization, artistic anarchist phase into its populist and social democratic socialist phase, and has liquidated into a kind of partyless art. Sectarians without a sect phase of ersatz, soft, and confused Marxist-Leninism. And again, that actually fits what happened to the 60s radicals in a lot of ways. So we're going to go into Goldner's review of Elbaum's book. Goldner is probably harsher to the book than I would have been, but I still think it's very useful. You can find this on LibCon, and I will share links to both Goldner's piece here and his website. Also, be looking out for an episode on his legacy with some friends of mine. Goldner's legacy, I mean. All right, let's get on to it. Loren Goldner reviews Max Elbaum's Revolutions in the Air, and in the process critically examines the Maoist and Third Worldist politics. didn't see the same movie. A review of Max Elbaum, Revolution in the Air, 60s Radicals Turned to Lenin, Mao, and Che, Verso, 2002. The sleep of dialectical reason will engender monsters. Without exactly setting out to do so, Max Elbaum in his book Revolutions in the Air has managed to demonstrate the existence of progress in human history, namely in the decline and disappearance of the grotesque Stalinist, Maoist, Third World Marxist, and Marxist-Leninist groups and ideologies he presents under the rubric the New Communist Movement as creations of pretty much the best and brightest coming out of the American 1960s. Asterisk. Goldner would not be happy to see that all these movements have basically come back in a kind of parody form of their already parody form of the New Communist Movement in the 1960s and 70s. Quote, who controls the past, Orwell says, controls the future. Read at a certain level, Elbaum's book, describing a mental universe that many respects out Orwell's, aims through the extended self-criticism to jettison 99% of what the third world Marxism stood for in its 70s heyday, in order to savage the 1% of the further muddled progressive politics for the future, particularly where the Democratic Party and unions are concerned, preparing progressive forces to paint a new face on the capitalist system after the neoliberal phase has shot its bolt. You know, where we were in the last 10 years, my friends. In many ways, people didn't learn Elbaum's lessons, and they definitely didn't learn Goldner's lessons about Elbaum's politics. I lived through the 1960s too, in Berkeley, of all places. Him, Hal Draper, a lot of people. I was in the anti-Stalinist revolutionary milieu, then called the Independent Socialist Clubs, which by the late 1970s had spawned 8 different offshoots. The Independent Socialist Clubs have a relationship to Hal Draper, actually. A milieu the author identifies with a Eurocentric Marxism. We argued that every state in the world, from the Soviet Union to China to Cuba to North Vietnam and North Korea by way of Albania, was a class society and should be overthrown by working class revolution. We said the same thing about all third world national liberation movements and states resulting from them, such as Algeria and those in the then Portuguese colonies, Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau. And we were dead right. And Max Elbaum's third world Marxists, who cheerlead for the most or all of them, were dead wrong. This is now clear as day for all eyes to see. Well, it apparently wasn't, Goldner, because people still resurrected, shortly about 10 years after this book came out, a lot of those point of views. I mean, it is not of any surprise that Jay Sakai's Settlers was written out of this 70s New Communist Movement's failure, and Sakai actually wrote the most extreme form of it. And it was revived as a kind of shadow self of social democratic politics. In other words, the end of the alter globalization movement actually kind of saw the new left emerge in reverse and then back again. From the sectarian milieu that have been left by the new left and the new communist movement, emerging after the alter globalization movement seemingly stalled out on its refusal to make demands and capitulations to a popular front with the Democratic Party, to social democrats emerging to do the same thing, but at a national executive level. The shadow self of this was to pretend that no good politics would ever come out of the developed world, because everyone was equally guilty, and some person far away could somehow bring this revolution to the forefront by nature of them being far away and highly oppressed. We based our perspective on realities that did and do not to this day exist for Elbaum and his friends. The question of whether the Russian Revolution died in 1921, Kronstadt, or 1927, the defeat of the left opposition. In Elbaum's milieu, the choice was between 1953, the death of Stalin, and 1956, Khrushchev's speech to the 20th Party Congress. Eurocentrics that we were, we took notice of Stalin's treacherous and disastrous China policy in 1927, which Mao Zedong at the time had criticized from the right, of Stalin's treacherous and disastrous third period policy and its results in Germany, above all, but also throughout the colonial world, i.g., in the 1930s communes in Vietnam and China. We critique Stalin's treacherous and disastrous Popular Front policy, which led to a mutual defense pact with France, reining in of the French mass strike of the May-June of 1936, and above all, the crushing of the anarchists and Trotskyists, and with them the Spanish Revolution as a whole in Barcelona in May 1937. It also led to the abandonment of anti-colonial agitation by the Vietnamese and Algerian Communist parties in the name of anti-fascism. We were disturbed by the Moscow trials, whereby 105 of 110 members of Lenin's 1917 Central Committee were assassinated, and by the Hitler-Stalin Pact, through which Hitler handed over to the Gestapo dissident factions of the German Communist Party who had sought refuge in the Soviet Union, something often missed when Marxist-Leninists talk about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that there were prisoner exchanges of good communists to fascists. We read about Elbaum's one-time hero, Ho Chi Minh, who engineered the massacre of thousands of Vietnamese Trotskyists in 1945 when they advocated, with a real working-class base, armed resistance to the return of the English and French troops after World War II. Ho received them warmly under the auspices of the Yalta Agreement, wherein Uncle Joe had consented to further French rule in Indochina. Just remember that Stalin was capitulating to a lot of this. It's not Stalin's only capitulations to the West wasn't just, only weird thing that we deal with now wasn't just his creation of Israel, my friend. His support of the creation of Israel exceeding that of the United States at the time, except that Truman forced the State Department to go further. Stalin had done the same for Greece, where again Trotskyists were slaughtered while pushing for revolution, and in Western Europe, where French and Italian resistance movements were disarmed and sent home by their respective communist parties. We studied the workers' uprisings in East Berlin in 1953 and the Hungarian Revolution and the Polish worker unrest of 1956. We distributed the brilliant open letter to the Polish Workers' Party in 1965 of Koron and Mizorowski. We were heartened by the Polish workers' uprising of Gdansk and Gdynia in December 1970, which arguably heralded, through its 1980-81 expansion, the end of the Soviet Empire. Elbaum mentioned none of these in this post-1945 workers' revolts against Stalinism, which were undoubtedly too Eurocentric for him. They did, after all, take place in Europe, assuming that he heard about them. At the same time, he and his milieu have undoubtedly described those revolts against revisionism. From 1970 onward, I moved into a broader, more diffuse anti-Stalinist milieu in the Bay Area. We read Victor Serge's memoirs and Orwell's Homage to Catalonia. We discovered Lukács's History and Class Consciousness and The Situationist. We saw Chile's 1970-1973 Popular Front once again crushed by the same collaborationist policies which Elbaum's Stalinist lineage had first perfected in France and Spain in 1936, and unlike Elbaum and his friends, we were hardly startled when the Chinese Communist Party embraced Pinochet. Asterisk, by the way, they really did do that to piss off the USSR. It had not escaped our Eurocentric attention that China itself had pushed the Indonesian Communist Party to adopt the same Popular Front strategy in 1965, leading to a massacre of hundreds of thousands, a success for U.S. imperialism more than the offset of the later defeat in Indochina, and that it had applauded when the Ceylonese regime, in today's Sri Lanka, bloodily repressed its Trotskyist student movement in 1971. Asterisk. We today, and many people trying to celebrate good old CPC Marxism and the Soviet Union, except for the bad Khrushchev part, have often not only downplayed these things, but also downplayed the internecine killing between Marxist-Leninists themselves, and tried to make it seem like only Khrushchev was doing the Sino-Soviet split, and it had no implications for anti-communist action, including actions against Chilean socialists and actions against the Vietnamese themselves. Imagine that. Barn out on this one. We were not shaken like Elbaum and his friends when China went on to support the South African intervention against the MPLA in Angola, our call for the strengthening of NATO against Soviet social imperialism. Yeah, the Chinese did that, by the way. Our support the right-wing recruitment against the communist-influenced armed forces movement in Portugal from 1974 to 1975. If anything, today, this is why I'm talking again. One of the most maddening things is so many people trying to make these things disappear from history. It angers me to no end how communists lie to themselves about their own role and their own suppression. It is unforgivable in many ways. But one more college try, which bring back the past. That's how we're going to get the workers back on our side again. Is campism for regimes that have ugly histories. Even if I think, and I am defensist on China, I want people to know that. But my defensism on China is not to erase the realities of the consequences of the Sino-Soviet split and how it helped NATO. Or support the right-wing regroupment against communist influence on forces movement in Portugal in 1974 and 75. Remember, China was just trying to piss off in the 70s, despite running very internally left-wing policies. China was actually highly involved in stifling the Soviet Union and including, stifling communist revolts in the area of the third world themselves, which again is erased from history by a lot of these people. Elbaum and his friends were at the same time presenting the battle between two wings of the most elephantine bureaucracy of modern times as a brilliant success in putting politics in command against capitalist restorationists, technocrats, and intellectuals, and burning Beethoven for good measure. All of these writhings of Chinese Stalinism struck us as more of a second-time farce to the first-time tragedy of the worldwide ravages of Soviet Stalinism from the 1920s onward. Elbaum and his friends cheered on Pol Pot's Russification campaign in Cambodia, in which 1 million people died. No sooner than they digested the post 1976 development in China after Mao's death, the arrest and vilification of the Gang of Four, the completion of the turn to the U.S. in an anti-Soviet alliance. When in 1979, after Vietnam occupied Cambodia to depose of the Khmer Rouge, China attacked Vietnam, and the Soviet Union prepared to attack China. How difficult in those days to be a third world Marxist. Difficult indeed, and a history that many people who just want us to give a good old college try to Marxist Leninism want us to forget. We have been shaped by the worldwide renaissance of Marxism, set in motion by different diffusions of the early Marx and growing awareness of the Hegelian dimension of the late Marx and the Grundgesta, capital, and theories of surplus value. We leaned upon the unpublished sixth chapter of Volume 1 of Capital as demonstrating the essential continuity between the early and late Marx. Although we did not yet know that Marx is writing on the Russian mirror and ethnographic notebooks, which drew an even sharper line between the late Marx and the Bolderized productivist versions from the Second, Third, and Fourth Internationals. That last bit's a dig at Trotskyist. A familiarity with any of these currents would put pay to the Diemat worldview and text which is the standard fare of Elbaum's world. It was, of course, the Eurocentric to rethink Marx and official Marxism through new, unexplored content, not Eurocentric to observe Marx through the luminosity of Stalin, Beria, and Hoxha. The Marx, who had written an extensive journalism on India and China from the 1840s onward, may have been Eurocentric, but the brain-dead articles emanating from the Peking Review about the three goods and the four bads were, for these people, decidedly not. Rosa Luxemburg and everything she stood for, including her memorable writings, no doubt Eurocentric on the primitive accumulation in the colonial world and her rich material on pre-capital societies everywhere in Einführung de national economy, meant nothing to these people. Her critiques of Lenin in the earliest months of the Russian Revolution, not to mention before 1914, and of the right to national self-determination did not exist. Elbaum and his friends were not interested in the revolutionaries who had criticized Lenin during his lifetime or at any point, and they remained blissfully unaware of Bordiga, Gorda, and Pannekoek. The philosophical critiques of Kors and Lukács similarly meant nothing to them. They've never heard of the 1940s and 50s C.L.R. James, Rada Donetskaya, and the early Max Shachtman, Hal Draper, the French group Socialism or Barbarism, Paul Maddox Sr., Maximilian Rubel, the Italian workerist, Ernst Bloch, or Walter Benjamin. All, by the way, who get linked today in Western Marxism, many of whom actually lived in Eastern Germany and were loyal to the Soviets until the 1950s. even if they were skeptical of Stalinism. All right. Um, this idea that everybody who critiqued the Soviet Union uh, are the Communist Party of China, which, by the way, the Communist Party of China was critiquing the Soviet Union, was somehow a irredentionist Western Marxist without skin in the game, ignores history itself, and often links people who are radically opposed. Some people who are called Western Marxists are good Marxist Leninists who just say things that the current gaggle does not like. Far be it for any of you to be honest. They seriously argue for the aesthetics of the Chinese four revolutionary operas and such songs as the Mountain Brigade, Hell's the Arrival of the Night Soul Carriers, while the serious Marxist world was discovering the Frankfurt School, whatever the latter's limitations, and Guy Debord. Then there was the influence of the monthly review magazine and publishers. Baran and Sweezy had migrated from the Soviet Union to various third world anti-imperialists to China. They were infused with the Bundang climate of 1955, that's the non-aligned movement, and the brief moment of the Soviet Chinese neutralist anti-imperialist bloc. Names such as Sukarto, Nasser, and Nuraf loom large in this mindset, as did the latter tricontinental, Latin America, Africa, Asia, consciousness promoted by Cuba and Algeria. The 1966 book on Baran's Sweezy Monopoly Capital, which years into the crisis of the Bretton Woods system did not even mention credit, became a major theoretical reference for this crowd. Still a problem. In fact, part of the assertion of the monopoly capital is that the contradictions of capitalism were over. Makes it all, This was supplemented by international names such as Samara Min, Charles Bettelheim, Arrighi Emanuel, and the South American Dependency School. Arrighi Emanuel. You mean Giovanni Arrighi and Amalia Wallenstein. I think that's a weird screw up. That's a sick. And the South American Independence School, Cardoso, Privish, etc. But the linchpin was Lenin's theory of imperialism, with the idea of the imperialist super profits making support of a labor aristocracy and therefore the reformist Western working class, against which the whole world was ultimately aimed. Even today, after everything that has discredited Sweezy's economics, Elbaum still uses monopoly capital as one of his many unexamined concepts. And yeah, it still gets brought back. I mean, it's still, I love John Bellamy Foster as much as the next guy. I do. I've had him on my show. But their use of Sweezy and the assumptions of Sweezy as to move to make Marx about something other than economics. And I do think John Bellamy Foster's stuff on metabolism, even though metabolism as a metaphor, is actually pretty good. I do think that the Barana Sweezy stuff is actually really, really problematic. And a lot of people use Marx and Engels as a ventriloquist dummy at the in that world. Because of the world of Elbaum and his friends, while reading Capital may have been on the agenda of many study groups, in reality, in most cases, the study of Volume 1, which is tantamount to reading Hegel's Phenomenology only on the initial phase of sense certainty of the English empiricist and skepticism. It was far more, as he says, the pamphlets of Lenin are, if the truth be known, of Stalin, Beria, Mao, Ho, and Hoja, which were the main fare. Now, I would disagree with Goldner here that you can actually just list Stalin, Beria, Mao, Ho, and Hoja as the same kind of person. I agree with some of the atrocities committed by Ho, but Ho is a much more respectable figure than Beria and Stalin. And Mao is a world complicated figure for me. My favorite was Beria's On the History of the Bolshevik Organization and the Transcaucasus, reprinted in 1975 by some long-defunct Marxist-Leninist publisher. Elbaum is honest in retrospect. The publishing houses of the new communist organizations were issued almost nothing that remains of value to serious left researchers and scholars. He might have added that it wasn't worth reading at the time either, except briefly to experience the ideology run amok. Whereas for the political world I inhabited, the question was of the recovery of Soviets and workers' councils for direct democratic work and control of the entirety of production, perspective having its own limits, but far more interesting ones. By Elbaum's own account of the vision of the social society in Marxist-Leninist circles, rarely discussed beyond ritual bows to various third world models today utterly discredited, or the invocation of socialism in one rural commune, of William Hinton's Fansion are the writings on the Viet Cong democracy by the indefatigable Wilfred Burchett, who had also written lyrically about Stalin's Russia 30 years earlier. The real Marxian project of the abolition of the law of value, i.e., the regimentation of social life by socially necessary time of reproduction, existed for virtually no one in the 1960s, not for Elbaum, also not for me. But the monthly review Monopoly Capital worldview, in which capitalism was understood not as a valorization process, but as a quasi a Duranian system, ultimately of power and domination, matched perfectly with the, in reality, populist worldview of Elbaum et al. And populism keeps on coming back as if it's Marxism. We have never been populist. This is Varn talking. We are not now populist. We are not tomorrow populist. We will never be populist. And if you think populism is really expressing the definition of the working class, you are fucking foolish. Now, I will defend populism in a weak way like Christopher Lasch did late in his life as something emerging from real class conflicts that actually existed in the 19th century in the liquidation of agrarian labor in the developed world. And it made sense then, although it had its limitations. And its first limitation was William James Bryant dragging their ass back into the Democratic Party, or its concession to nationalism in ways that made it subsumed. But it had a quote progressive character. Nonetheless, we have never been the same as that. Attempts to make us that tend to make us the party of the moment, to be liquidated when the moment changes. Now, I don't believe in the invariant program like Borges do, but I do think you need to be of tougher stuff than made-to-order ideologies that you can just unsubscribe from. To quote our friends and the Manager's Taken. Anyway. Through Baran and Sweezy, a kind of left-wing Keynesianism pervaded the part of the left. Yes, and that's still today dominant. Relegating the law of value to the capitalism of Marx's time and following Lenin, seeing everything else since the 1890s as a power political monopoly capital. The anti-imperial was and is in reality an ideology of third world elites in and out of power. It was a developmentalist project, guys. That's what it was. And it's fundamentally anti-working class, like all the progressive regimes that have ever been established. It does not trouble Elbaum and his milieu that the world of the third world and the international trade has been declining from 1900 to the 1960s, are that 80% of all direct foreign investment takes place between three major capitalist sectors in US, Europe, and East Asia. So much for Lenin's theory of imperialism. Sounds a lot more like Kautsky's, as I've said for a long time. Although I will say that Lenin's theory of imperialism was actually pretty much correct for the time period it was written. It's just been trans-historicized. Now, I think I would disagree with Goldner on the extent in which Lenin was wrong. All right, I'm not an anti-Leninist to the extent Goldner is, but I have to admit that all these things that Goldner mentions has set with me ill while people are trying to pretend that this stuff didn't happen. The illusionary prosperity of the West, in their view, was paid for by the looting of the third world. And make no mistake, the third world was and is being looted. The ultimate implication of this outlook was, once again, to implicate the white, i.e. Eurocentric working class of the West, in the world imperialist system in the name of illusionary bureaucratic peasant utopias of labor-intensive agriculture. This working class in the advanced capitalist countries had, meanwhile, from 1955 to 1973, carried out the mounting wildcat insurgency in the U.S. and Berlin, May 1968 in France, and the creeping May of 1969 through 1977 in Italy, apparently not having been informed by Elbaum's third world Marxism that they were bought off by imperialism. A number of unexamined concepts run through Elbaum's book from beginning to end: revisionism, anti-revisionism, Leninism, Marxist-Leninism, ultra-leftism. Elbaum never explains that revisionism meant to this milieu, above all, the ideological demotion of Stalin after 1953, and therefore those who called themselves anti-revisionists were identifying implicitly or explicitly, and usually explicitly, Stalin's Russia with some betrayed Marxist orthodoxy. In contraposition of revisionist anti-revisionism, Elbaum does not demote one line to the consolidation in 1924 of the grotesque concept of socialism in one country, a concept that would have made Lenin, whatever his other problems, wretch. Not for nothing that had Lenin's last testament called for Stalin's removal as general secretary, and the fact counted for nothing in the mental universe of third world Marxism. There's a lot of people, including some scholars, who think that was fake. I'm still not sure. For someone who is writing about it on every page, Elbaum has, in fact, no real theory of Stalinism whatsoever. Whereas Emilio and I frequently stayed up late at night to determine if the seeds of Stalinism were in Leninism, Elbaum and his friends saw mainly or entirely an unproblematic continuity between Lenin and Stalin and affirmed it. As for Marxist Leninism, Elbaum does admit that it was a concoction of Stalin. Its subsequent career, Marxist Leninism could mean anything to anyone, of anything, of course, except the power of the Soviets and workers' councils, in which every failed proletarian revolution of the 20th century, Russia 1905 and 1970 1921, Germany 1918 to 1921, Spain 1936 to 67, Hungary 1956, France 1968, were more generous common elements than all the large and small totalitarians and Elbaum's third world Marxist pantheon put together. I want to call out that I've also noticed that Marxist Leninism, for all its call for orthodoxy, and there are orthodox Marxist Leninists out there, some of which I even respect, tends to be whatever you fucking want it to be. Right? It just means usually state good, something else good. But the people today, particularly now that there's no that other than the PSCSL and the CPUSA, people adopting this kind of adopted in a media fashion will combine multipolarity, Keynesianism, MMT, whatever the fuck into their things. Now, I do think that dogmatically insisting that nothing has changed ever in the development of capitalism and that everything written early on is completely applicable today is kind of bizarre and weird. I also think there's a lot of people who are pretending they're orthodox while changing every fucking thing in the script is nutty to me. And this is something Goldner stood up against, and you see it here. Ultra-leftism for Elbaum means little self-appointed vanguards running amok and demarcating themselves from real movements. Elbaum seems quite aware of the true historic ultra-left. Quite unaware of the true historic ultra-left. Yeah, this is also a problem in Camejo and the way people used ultra-left today and the DSA until very recently. One can agree or disagree with Pannekoek, whose mass strike writings influenced Lenin's State and Revolution. Yeah, they did. Gorder, who told Lenin in 1921 that the Russian revolutionary model could not be mechanically transposed upon Western Europe, or Borga, who called Stalin the great digger of the revolution to his face in 1926 and lived to tell the tale. One of the things when people bring up everyone's favorite medievalist turned Soviet historian, Grover Furr, is Grover Furr has Trotsky saying what Borga said and completely misinterprets it because Furr doesn't really seem to know the history, even though he does occasionally find interesting documents in the Soviet archives. But such people and the genuine mass movements in Germany, Holland, and Italy that produced them are noble tradition which hardly deserves to be confused rhetorically with the thuggish antics of the happily defunct League of Proletarian Socialism, the latter name being true contradictio in objecto, inadvertently revealing the bureaucratic dreams. Marxian socialism means the abolition of wage labor and hence of the proletariat as a commodity form of human labor power. As indicated above, such figures as charismatic Cordiatis and the early C.L.R. James, whatever their problems, can similarly be considered part of the ultra-left. And unlike the products of Elbaum's milieu, their writings were eminently worth reading today. One Dutch Marxist organizing in Indonesia in 1908 had already grasped the basically bourgeois nature of nationalism in the then colonial world, an idea that Elbaum was still catching up with in 2002. Internationalism for Elbaum means cheerleading the latest third world Marxist movement or regime, but in reality, his vision of the world is laughably America-centric. I've noticed this before amongst a lot of people who won't shut the fuck up about multipolarity today. He refers on occasion as a source of inspiration for his review to the French mass strike of 1968, which swept aside all the self-appointed vanguards, Marxist-Leninists first of them all. But this is lost on Elbaum. By the early 1970s, Trotskyist groups had clearly out-organized the Marxist-Leninists, and for what it's worth, today the two largest Trotskyist groups, Lutte Ouvrière and Liga Communiste, together account for 10% of the vote in the French election and are now larger than the Communist Party, without a Marxist-Leninist in sight. In Britain, similarly, Trotskyists organized the Marxist-Leninists hands down, played an important role in the 1972 strike wave, never mentioned by Elbaum, and today the British Socialist Workers' Party, not to be confused with the American rump of the same name, is the largest group to the left of labor. Now, this is from 20 years ago. All this stuff, Trotskyism's collapsed in our lifetime uh, for reasons beyond the scope of this essay, but I think it needs to be noted. But at the time, there's a reason why Trotskyism represented a lot of this. Elbaum referred to the passing to the Japanese far left in the 1960s as an influence on some Japanese Americans, but he seems blissfully unaware that the Zingakarun were overwhelmingly anti-Stalinist and mainly viewed Russia and China as state capitalists. The most creative and internationally influential currents of the Italian 1970s, the so-called opperisti or workerists, were breaking with the Leninists from the early 1970s at the latest. To be fair, in Italy and Germany, large Maoist and Marxist-Leninist groups did exist, and the Trotskyists were basically marginal. And it's also fair to notice that operaismo and autonomism emerged out of the Marxist-Leninist milieu, despite the fact that they get characterized as anarchists today somehow. On the subject of Trotsky, I am not a Trotskyist and have basically, as previously indicated, since my callow youth, viewed all so-called social societies as class societies, and not, as Trotskyists do, as worker states. But I have more respect for Trotsky, who can be distinguished from Trotskyists, than I ever will have for Stalin, Mao, Ho, Kim Il-sung, Castro, Guevara, or Cabral. I don't hate Cabral, Guevara, or Castro myself, and I don't hate Ho. But Mao is a best of times, worst of times figure. Stalin, for me, is pragmatism as opportunism and bloody farce. And I'm not going to go into Kim Il-sung right now. Wearing the blinders of his milieu, Elbaum shows real ignorance of Trotskyism, third world Marxist Philistine hatred for Trotsky, while generally not stooping to the 1930s Trotsky, the agent of Maldiko type slander, were exceeded only by such ignorance. Blinded by his milieu's complete acceptance and positive continuity with Lenin and Stalin, the world of the early 1920s, which decisively shaped both Trotskyism and the above-mentioned ultra-left and the last 80 years of human history, have no importance for him. Hence, as indicated earlier, the triumph of socialism in one country after 1924 and the total subordination of all communist parties to the Soviet foreign project are totally unproblematic for these people, as were all the debacles of the Comintern mentioned earlier. Similarly, the question of the relationship of the Bolshevik Party and the Soviet state to the Soviets and workers' councils, i.e. the question of the actual working class management of society, which was settled and the negative by 1921, is of no consequence either. It's Eurocentric to be concerned about Soviet history before the rise of Stalin, not Eurocentric to manage Stalin's Russia, with its 2 million peasants killed in the 1930s collectivization, its massacre of the Bolshevik Old Guard and the Moscow trials, its factories operating with killing sped up under the GPU's control, are its 20 million people in slave labor camps at the time of Stalin's death. For such revisionism must therefore be Khrushchev, an equally top-down attempt to decompress a bit of this nightmare. The memory of Stalin's Russia still weighs on the consciousness of the masses of people around the world who seemingly inevitably outcome of trying to do away with capitalism, and reinforces the still important neoliberal mantra, there is no alternative, but why people like Elbaum described the most dynamic parts of the American left in the 1970s were so taken with Stalin's legacy never seemed to strike him as a major problem to be addressed. I mean, I think it's interesting that I keep on hearing about the anarchist stuff, the new left, that the fact that it led to the new communist movement and its dissolution is never really talked about. Yes, there was rampant anti-communism and gross misrepresentations of the USSR that even perpetuated through the new left. Absolutely true. It is also true that there's a whole lot of shit that the anti-revisionists tried to ignore, including divisions within themselves. And they try to ignore it still today. Elbaum might also inform himself about Trotsky's and Marx's theory of permanent revolution, which was the centerpiece of the Bolshevik international strategy in 1917. And its repudiation by Stalin was key to all the post-1924 politics swallowed up whole 45 years later by Elbaum's Third World Marxists. Permanent revolution, rightly or wrongly, meant the possibility that a revolution in a backwards country like Russia could link up with, or even aspire, see Marx's preface to the 1882 Russian edition of the Manifesto, revolution in the developed European heartland, and in that way be spared the bloody primitive accumulation process which every capitalist country, from Britain to Russia to contemporary China, has necessarily undergone. It is this theory and not some Eurocentrism that made a small minority of honest Trotskyists keep their distance from regimes using third world Marxism as a fig leaf for capital's primitive accumulation. Most Trotskyists were howling with the wolves that Vietnam will win. Well, we have seen Vietnam and even more Cambodia won. This is hardly the place to describe the devolution of Trotskyism after Trotsky, but the honesty and courage of convictions were not the strong suit of the Mandels and Baronesses and Pablos who shaped it after 1940. Elbaum sees the American SWP as the main face of Trotskyism for the 1960s and 70s leftists in the US, and he's right about that, and claims that Trotskyism's involvement with the old 1930s issues and the European question was the main hindrance to the larger impact of Trotskyism within the third world, from China to Vietnam to Cuba, were supposedly sibling with revolution and building socialism. In point of fact, watching the SWP like their frick counterparts, the communists in the 1960s and 70s, I can only laugh up my sleeve watching the very way they buried their critique of Stalinism, as was the case with the Vietnamese NLF. In the fine print of their theoretical journals were rushing after popularity, waving NLF flags in the exact milieu influenced by Elbaum's third world Marxism. To take only one anecdotal example, in a 1969 debate in Berkeley between the ISC and the SWP, we put the SWP spokesperson, Pete Camejo, I mentioned him earlier, up against the wall about the 1945 massacre of the Vietnamese Trotskyists in front of the New Left audience, and Camejo conceded that, yes, Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh had, in fact, oppressed Vietnamese comrades of the Fourth International. I'm sure most of the New Left cheerleaders present considered our point to be ancient history, 25 years earlier. Today, as they watch Vietnam rush into market socialism with investment capital from Toyota and Mitsubishi, I am sure they don't think about it at all. I remember Camejo's brother, Tony, telling a similar audience that we wouldn't be too critical of Black and Latino nationalism in the US because Black and Latinos had not yet passed through their bourgeois revolution, as if American Blacks and Latinos didn't also live in the most advanced capitalist country in the world. But we had to put our finger on a certain reality, since many of the Black and Latino nationalists in the 1960s and 70s were, in fact, on their way to middle-class careers. Once shouting died down as uninterested in the nationalism in the 1960s and 70s were, in fact, once the shouting down was uninterested in general and proletarian revolution, and the true 20th century example of it today as they were then. They were and are in no way different from the great majority of the white New Left. Max Elbaum approvingly quotes Tariq Ali attacking those who, such as myself and the ISC, to which I belong, saw no difference between Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek, Castro or Batista. Well, I would also attack them. There is differences. It doesn't mean they're good. Whereas all the world's history since Ali has uttered the remark that has demonstrated nothing except the main difference between the old-style U.S.-backed dictators and the third-world Marxist dictators with state power is that the latter better prepare their countries for full-blown capitalism, with Mao's China Exhibit A for prosecution and Vietnam following close behind. Furthermore, Elbaum never seems to notice that many of the 20th century Marxists still worth reading today, and he apparently has not read them, such as the early Shachtman, James, Draper, Coriatis, made most of their important contributions in the break to the left of Trotskyism. In the 35 years in leftist politics, I have met many ex-Stalinists and Maoists who became Trotskyists and council communists. I have never met anyone who went in the opposite direction. I have. As a side note, I have. Once you played Grandmaster Chess, you rarely go back. I think the difference, however, is the people who go back now are have never lived with people actually defending really existing regimes. Finally, while Elbaum rightly says that the current turn 1969 of thousands of new leftists to the American working class was largely fruitless, he does neglect one important counterexample, namely the success of the International Socialist, named the ISC after 1970, and building the Teamsters for a Democratic Union, the TDU, and through it being the spark plug for the election of Ron Kerry as president of the Teamsters in 1991. There is no question that this development, however much it turned into a fiasco, was the most important left-wing intervention in the American labor movement since the 1940s. I no more wish to go off on a long tangent about the terribly botched episode that I wish to expand on the history of Trotskyism. I left the IS milieu in 1969. A lot of my favorite writers are people who leave the IS milieu. Draper himself in some ways, but also Rain Price, etc. Even though I have issues with Price. The IS's success with the TDU came at the price of bearing, or at least for the purposes of the Teamster politics, the fact that they were socialists, not merely honest trade unionists. It turned out that Kerry wasn't even that. Anyone educated in Trotskyist groups in the IS, despite its rejection of socialist character of so-called worker states, was a Trotskyist in every other question. In contrast to most Stalinist and Maoist groups, develops a healthy aversion to trade union bureaucracy into the Democratic Party. Yeah, everyone else's entry as Popular Frontist. And you would think after the Popular Front just exploded in everyone's face, they would learn something about that, but apparently they're wrong. Elbaum provides a long history of how Mao was involved out of the wreckage of the old CPUSA after the 1960 Sino-Soviet split. Some of these groups look back to the CP under Browder, others preferred William C. Foster, but almost all of them saw something positive in the CP's role during the Roosevelt era, both in the Democratic Party and in the CIO. The problem of those working off of Trotskyism was, on the contrary, the bureaucracy and developed exactly the way to see in the area of CP influence. The problem of those working off of Marxist-Leninism was revisionism. Stalin and Maoism, for some reason, don't have too much to say about bureaucracy, except as in the Cultural Revolution, when they're supporting one bureaucratic faction against the other. I think that's an unfair characterization of Maoism. I do think that, yes, it was supporting one bureaucratic faction against the other, but the revolution in the countryside during the Cultural Revolution was actually pretty serious. Was and led to actual strengthening of working class bonds. I'm not quite as willing to throw it under the bus. What I can't reconcile is that the period where that was actually happening in China was also the period where China was like doing really opportunistic things, supporting right-wing regimes to fight the Soviets. Anyway, so I wouldn't go as far as Goldner does here, but I think it is important. And the concept of revisionism rarely inculcated the people against seeking influence in high places, either with the Democratic politicians or with trade union bureaucrats, as the CP had done successfully in its heyday. It is certainly true that many of Elbaum's Marxist-Leninists did neither. He seems to ignore the fact that the ability of a group like the IS to intersect with the Teamsters Rank and File rebellion of the 1970s and thereafter has something to do with the fact that they, in contrast to every Marxist-Leninist around, were not approaching the American working class with tall tales about socialism in Cuba, Albania, or Cambodia, or North Korea. The oh-so-radical defenders of Beijing's line, whatever for or against the Gang of Four, turned out to be defending a considerable part of the global status quo. Finally, if Elbaum would lift his head out of the rubble with third world Marxism, he might notice that in Britain and France, Trotskyists had a solid mass base, whatever one thinks of the politics involved, whereas Marx and Leninists had almost nowhere to be seen. And in the politically backward US, groups like the ineffable ISO, not to mention the useful anarchist scene, are attracting more people interested in revolution than any Marxist-Leninist. That was true then. That's not true today. Remember, this was written after 2002. That was in the days of the alter globalization movement and the growth of the ISO, which has now collapsed and liquidated itself primarily into the DSA, which is also seemingly going bankrupt. So everybody looks bad today. Being for the overthrow of every government in the world, it lets you go see and do things in the baggage of Pol Pot or shining path for Kim Jong-il conceals. It is now time to turn to the merits of Elbaum's book, which, contrary to what the reader may conclude from the above, it indeed has. First, and I have to say, I have no quarrel with Elbaum attacks the good 60s to bad 60s visions of figures such as Todd Glintlin, for whom the late 1960s turned revolution was the bad 60s compared to the early 60s per Huron vision of participatory democracy. Revolution was necessary then and is necessary today, whatever the current ideological climate might favor. Elbaum is also right in critiquing Glitlin's and many others' almost exclusive focus on white New Left, seeing the movement essentially collapse with the SDS in the 1969-1970 and not recognizing its extension, particularly among blacks and Latinos, not to mention thousands of white New Leftists who went into the factories and the wildcat strikes that lasted until 1973. But Elbaum does put his finger on the fact that the third world Marxist, Stalinist, Marxist-Leninist, and Maoist milieu was much more successful in the 1960s and 70s in attracting and influencing militants of color. And he's equally right in saying that most of the Trotskyist currents, not to mention the post-Trotskyists of which I was closest, were partially blind to America's blind spot, the centrality of race in the American classes equation. The ISC, when I was in in Berkeley in the late 1960s, was all for Black Power, and like many other groups, worked with the Panthers, but itself had virtually no Black members. Trotsky's group, such as the SWP, did have some, as did all the others, but there is no question that Elbaum's milieu was far more successful with Blacks, Latinos, and Asians, as was the CPUSA. To cut to the quick, I think that the answer to this difference was relatively straightforward. As Elbaum himself points out, many people of color who threw themselves into the ferment of the 1960s and 1970s and joined revolutionary groups were the first generation of their families to attend college. Hint, hint. When people complain about the Black PMC, it's often the Black PMC who are complaining. And were rather, whether they knew it or not, on their way to the middle class. Thus, it is hardly surprising when one thinks about it, they would be attracted to regimes and movements of progressive middle class elites in the third world. This was just as true in a different way for many transient militants of the white New Left, similarly bound after 1973 for the professional classes, not to mention the actual ruling class offspring, one found in such groups as the Weathermen. Aren't, most of the Marxist-Leninist groups today. Elbaum does point out that the white membership of many third world Marxist groups was for working class families and were similarly the first generation of families to attend college. Yeah, this is true too. This is Varn agreeing with that. He also shows the preponderant origins of such people in the prairie radicalism, i.e., populism of the Midwest, in contrast to the more European left of the two coasts, an important clue to their essentially populist politics. These are important social, historical, and cultural insights, which could be developed much further. Charles Dimby's Black Workers Notebook, Dimby was a member of Wyatt Dennis News and Letters group, effectively identifies the middle class character of the Black Power milieu around Stokely Carmichael et al., as well as Black workers' distance from it. The Detroit-based League of Revolutionary Black Workers similarly critiqued the Black nationalist middle class, though it was hardly anti-nationalist itself. It is undeniable that the 1960s movement of peoples of color in the U.S. was influenced by the global climate of decolonization of most of Africa, the Middle East, and Asia following World War II, and the decentering of actual Eurocentric views of Western and world history following the 1914 through 1945 decentering of Europe and the new lines drawn by the Cold War. They were similarly influenced by, and themselves were the main force enacting, the shattering of centuries of white supremacy in American society. It would be idealistic and immoralistic to explain their attraction to third world Marxism, Maoism, and Marxist-Leninism by a meaningless assertion that they had the wrong ideas. One important part of the answer is definitely the weight of the arriving middle class element in these political groups who are today to be found in the Black and Latino professional classes. But the typical Black, Latino, or Asian militant in the U.S. raving Mao's Little Red Book or chanting, "We want a pork chop off the pig," were not signing on for Stalin's Gulag or the millions who died in Mao's Great Leap Forward in 1957, or the mass murder in Pol Pot's Cambodia, or the ghoulish toll shrub on numbers of political period in Sekou Touré's Guinea, where the Black nationalist Stokely Carmichael spent his last days with no dissent anyone ever heard about. Any more than the working class militant in the CPUSA in 1935 were signing on for the Moscow trials or the massacre of Spanish anarchists and Trotskyists. All the above real history and theory blotted out or falsified by third world Marxists was available and known in the 1960s and thereafter by those who saw it. The question is precisely one of exactly when the groups of the people in motion are ready to seek and hear certain truths. When Elbaum can't face that, what Elbaum can't face is that the entirety of the third world Marxism was and is anti-working class, whether in Saigon in 1945, or Budapest and Poznan in 1956, or Jakarta in 1965, or in the case of all the Shanghai workers slaughtered in the midst of the Cultural Revolution in 1966 to 69, workers, white and non-white, in the American 60s sense more clearly than Elbaum's minions, blinded by ideology. As Marx said in the 18th Brumaire, speaking of the English Revolution of the 1640s, the same way, but in different stages of development. Cromwell and the English people have borrowed for their bourgeoisie the revolution, language, and passions of the Old Testament, when the actual goal had been, when the bourgeois transformation of English society had been accomplished, Locke drove out the habuk, aka we all LARP until we don't. When the upwardly mobile middle class elements in the 1960s and 1970s, new left and third world Marxists, both white but also important numbers of blacks and Latinos, had established themselves in their professional and civic service jobs and academic tenure, It's always said that as a positive that the female Black Panthers ended up as professors and the male Black Panthers in jail, as if that wasn't a condemnation of the failure of both. And that's always struck me as weird. Suburban life and VCRs drove out Ho, Che, and Mao, aka everyone went back to normal. And this is the part of the Elbaum book I've warned people about. People can be radical for a couple of years and just fucking drop it. And you're seeing it right now. Some people are going to double down on their radicalism, but most people are just going to walk away. Things were quite different, above all for blacks without a ticket to the middle class, and as one can see in the difference in the ultimate fates of the Weather Underground after years of the one and the black political prisoners such as Geronimo Platt. But to conclude, if Elbaum had offered us hundreds of pages on the wars of sex and ideologies that no one, himself included, misses, it is not from an antiquarian impulse. The real agenda is spelled out in one of the effusive blurbs on the dust cover. Finally, we have one book that can successfully concoct the dots between the battles of the 1960s and the emerging challenges and struggles of the new century. The giveaway is Elbaum's treatment of Jesse Jackson's presidential campaign of 1984 and 88, which is presented as something as almost as momentous as the 1960s. Yeah, people block this out. Jesse Jackson is in his Rainbow Coalition is a precursor to Bernie, and it failed similarly. In a moment of reaction, and the millennial left and the Gen Z left just don't fucking know about it. All right. Anyway. And which offered a few Marxist-Lenin groups, the Marxist-Leninists for Mondale, as one once called them, still around their last chance at mass influence. In contrast to the 1960s, the Jackson campaign came and went with no lasting impact, except to further illustrate the dead end of the old Rooseveltian New Deal coalition and the Keynesian welfare state that was once the bread and butter of the old Democratic Party and of the CPUSA strategy within the Democratic Party, aka, that thing that Bashkar Sansara tried to resurrect and we now seeing fall apart, and his organization seemingly to lose all its money. Anyway. And when all is said and done, the fatal legacy of the CP's role at the height of Stalinism in the mid-1930s is Elbaum's legacy as well. Just as he tells us nothing about the true origins of Marxist-Leninism and Third World Marxism, Elbaum tells us nothing about the CPUSA coming off its 1930s heroic phase, herding the American working class off to World War II through the enforcement of a no-strike pledge, with the calamity of any critic of American imperialism's moment of arrival at world power as a Hitlero-fascist, and applause in the Daily Worker for Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So it is necessary to concoct some further dots. This book aims at being a contribution to some new progressive coalition, wedding the American working class to some revamping of a capitalist state and an all-out drive to beat Bush around the Dean campaign or something like it in 2004. It joins the groundswell of dissent amongst capitalist forces themselves, currently being articulated by the likes of George Soros, Jeffrey Sachs, Joseph Stiglitz, and Paul Krugman, as the still dominant neoliberal paradigm of the past 25 years begins to seriously fray. And by the way, did fray in 2007. I know we keep on talking about neoliberalism. We live in some weird post-neoliberalism, which has neoliberal characteristics, but other characteristics. Nonetheless, here we are. While Elbaum's book makes occasional passing references to economic hard times of the past 25 years, begins economic tough times in the 1970s, he doesn't see the extent to which the American decline has circumscribed any possible agenda of reform, which can only be some kind of tax the rich, share the declining wealth kind of left populism with a suitably diverse forces, which will probably be the final fruit of the progressive middle class, white and people of color, that evolved out of Elbaum's Third World Marxism. Despite what Elbaum thinks and what he and his milieu thought 30 years ago, the fate of the world is in the hands of the world working class. In contrast to 30 years ago, however, the world working class is no longer limited to North America, Europe, and Japan, but is now spread through the many parts of the anti-imperialist Third World, led by China. The East will be read again, not as a bureaucratic peasant hallucination of Third World Marxism in the 1960s and 70s, but a genuine working class revolt against precisely the forces that use Third World Marxism in the Third World as in the US and Europe, to muddle every social question and advance the social stratum. The remnants of the forces are positioned today in and around the Democratic Party and trade union bureaucracy, as well as the anti-globalization movement, readying themselves again to revamp the capitalist system with turns of progressive rhetoric, as they did in the 1930s and 1940s. The only thing progressive in today's world is a working class revolution. I don't go as far as Goldner in a lot of things, and I do not think that simply because I oppose elements or I see elements of fatal flaws in all of the Marxist-Leninist ideologies. I also see them a lot of left-com ideologies and center-left ideologies as well. So here we are. I mourn Goldner's loss. He was often a point of rage at the concessions made by people who pretended they weren't making concessions. And I'm going to miss that voice. He's one of the people, along with Gilles Duvet, who introduced me to Bordiga and Panacook for good and ill. Nonetheless, here we are. Read Max Elbaum's book. But also read it closely and critically. And read Goldner, but read him closely and critically too. I think he's too hard on some of the Marxist Ronist failures, even though I am equally appalled by the erasure of the ugly history of the failures of the Comintern and of the failures of the revolutionary moments of the 20th century. To blacken them out only in our completely fair and only in our failures as a kind of ghost just makes Derrida's Spectres of Marx look sadder and more correct in time. Don't do that. Like and subscribe, hit the bell. We're going to be losing a lot of greats, and we've lost a lot of greats in the last 5 years. I don't know who's going to replace them. I'm not seeing a whole lot on the horizon. Protect your peace. Be the leader that you need. Take care.